Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're looking at a book that's been causing quite a stir in the free speech world.
Oh, yeah?
It's called Trigger Warning.
Hmm.
Is the fear of being offensive killing free speech?
I've heard of it.
It's written by Mick Hume. He's got this really sharp, witty style and doesn't hold back at all, which makes it a pretty fun read, actually.
Yeah.
We're going to go chapter by chapter,
Okay.
unpack his arguments, and see why this book is so relevant today, in our current climate.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Hume's book is like a wake-up call. For anyone who's concerned about free speech these days, like, how it's being eroded, he just goes straight at this complex issue.
Right.
And whether you agree with him or not, it definitely makes you think.
Yeah.
Really makes you think about where the limits of tolerances are and what freedom even means in this digital age,
All right, so let's jump right in. Chapter 1, The Right to be Offensive. Hume gets straight to the point.
Yeah.
He argues that this fundamental right, this right to be offensive, is under attack.
Yeah.
And not just from the usual suspects like, extremist groups.
Right, right.
But also from those who consider themselves part of, well, civilized society.
Interesting. Well, what's fascinating is how he uses the Charlie Hebdo massacre as a starting point.
Oh, yeah.
Remember that horrific attack on the satirical magazine that published those cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad? There was this huge global outpouring of support. But Hume, he points out something kind of interesting. A lot of this support, it wasn't necessarily about defending the magazine's right to offend. It was more about sympathy for the victims.
Yeah, it's like there was this unspoken message like, okay, we support free speech, but maybe you shouldn't have pushed it so far.
Yeah, exactly.
And to really hit this point home, Hume brings up the case of the French comedian Dieudonné Mbala.
Oh, right.
He was arrested for a Facebook post. He said it was condoning terrorism.
It really shows how even humor, like even dark humor, it's being policed more and more these days in the name of,
anti-terrorism.
Yeah, combating terrorism. And it makes you wonder, where do we draw the line between free speech and, what they consider harmful content?
It's not just comedians and satirists feeling the pressure either. Hume calls out politicians who, on one hand, are all about free speech.
Right.
But then they push for laws that criminalize offensive online content. He even talks about how ironic it is that UK police chiefs expressed solidarity with Charlie Hebdo.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they were cracking down on tabloid journalists.
It makes you wonder, is there a double standard going on here? Like, who gets to decide what's okay to say and what's not?
Yeah.
And this is where the whole trigger warning thing comes in. Hume sees this whole trend of trigger warnings as part of a bigger thing, this intolerance toward anything that might make someone feel uncomfortable.
It's almost like we're trying to create this world where no one's ever offended.
Yeah.
Where we're never challenged. But isn't that kind of the opposite of what free speech is all about?
Exactly. That's a great point. And it leads perfectly into chapter 2. Free speech is for fools and fanatics, too.
Okay.
Hume makes this really strong argument that free speech, it has to be defended for everyone.
Even for people we disagree with.
Even for people with views we find totally abhorrent or even dangerous.
Right. And he uses this great analogy. He talks about a criminal haggling over the price of a gun.
Okay.
To show the difference between words and actions. Protecting free speech doesn't mean we're protecting criminal activity.
Right, of course not.
It's about protecting the right to express ideas.
Yeah.
Even if those ideas are unpopular or offensive.
Right, and legally speaking, the Supreme Court has tried to define what speech is actually unprotected.
Right, like fighting words, which are words that directly incite violence.
Right, and he brings in this really powerful quote from David Bow, a Black American civil liberties lawyer.
Who actually defended the free speech rights of a KKK leader. Bow said, "In America, we have the right to hate, and we have the right to discuss it." It's a pretty strong statement, right?
Yeah.
Especially coming from someone who's personally experienced the effects of hate speech.
Yeah, that's pretty powerful. And it really shows that defending free speech means defending it for everyone, even those whose views we find completely repulsive. And throughout history, social progress has often come from people who are willing to challenge the status quo, express views that were seen as radical or offensive at the time.
Exactly. Think about the civil rights movement.
Right.
Or the fight for women's suffrage.
Yeah.
Those movements wouldn't have happened without the freedom to express dissenting views.
It's ironic, isn't it? We celebrate those historical figures who fought for free speech. But then today we see people attacking free speech, often in the name of defending rights and freedoms. It feels like there's this growing gap between saying, we support free speech,
Right.
and actually putting it into practice. That's at the heart of Chapter 3, where Hume introduces this concept of reverse Voltaires.
Okay, so for those who don't know, Voltaire was a huge advocate for free speech.
Yeah.
And he famously said, "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it."
Right, a classic quote.
But the reverse Voltaires, as Hume calls them, are basically the opposite. They want the right to stop others from speaking.
Yeah, they believe that if speech is offensive or harmful,
Right.
it should just be silence. It's like a complete 180 from the whole principle of free speech.
Yeah, like saying, "I'm so offended by what you're saying, I have the right to make you stop."
Yeah.
And what's ironic is we see Western governments cracking down on offensive speech, while at the same time criticizing other countries for doing the same thing.
Right. It raises the question, what role does outrage play in all of this? Hume says this intolerance, it's driven by a culture of outrage, where people are quick to take offense and demand censorship. Online petitions, Twitter storms, these are like the tools of the reverse Voltaires, driving this whole trend of shutting down anything that's deemed offensive or inappropriate. And he gives the example of pickup artist Julian Blanc,
Oh, yeah.
who was banned from entering the UK because of public outcry over his views on women.
Right. And that's interesting because it raises questions about whether public pressure or online outrage should actually dictate who's allowed into a country.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, his views might have been sexist and offensive,
Sure.
but should he have been banned from entering the UK? It's a tough one.
Yeah, it brings up this really crucial point. Where do we draw the line? If we start censoring anything that someone might object to, where does it stop?
Right. And that brings us to, a place where this whole free speech debate has been really heated.
Oh, yeah.
The university campus. Chapter 5, the University Front. Students fight for freedom from speech. Hume looks at how universities, they used to be these places known for free speech.
Right. Open inquiry, all that.
Yeah, bastions of free speech, right. But they're becoming more and more like, places of censorship.
It is kind of ironic when you think about it. I mean, you'd think universities would be like the most open to different viewpoints.
You'd think so, right? But, like Hume says, there's been this shift in thinking on campuses. A lot of students and faculty, they're actually pushing for what he calls freedom from speech.
So what does that even mean?
It means freedom from having to even hear ideas that they find offensive or upsetting. So basically, they don't want to be exposed to anything that makes them uncomfortable.
Okay, but isn't that the opposite of what a university should be? Like, shouldn't they be challenging their beliefs?
Exactly. And one of the big things Hume talks about is this no platform policy. It was originally meant to stop really hateful speakers like neo-Nazis or white supremacists, prevent them from spreading their message. But it's expanded now. It's used to shut down a much wider range of speakers and topics that some people just find offensive. So we're seeing debates and events canceled on campuses.
Really?
Yeah, because of worries about the content being offensive.
What kind of events?
Well, Hume mentions a debate on abortion at Oxford and even a comedy routine by Bill Maher at Berkeley.
Wow.
Both got shut down because of protests from students.
It's almost like they've taken this idea of safe spaces too far,
Yeah, it's meant to protect students from harassment and discrimination.
Right.
But in some cases, it's creating this environment where students are shielded from any ideas that might challenge their worldview. They're never uncomfortable.
It does make you wonder if that's actually doing them a disservice, in the long run. Like, if they're never exposed to different perspectives, how are they supposed to grow? How do they learn to think critically?
It's a tough question, On the one hand, you want to create an environment where students feel safe and respected. But on the other hand, if they're never challenged, if they never have to confront ideas that make them uncomfortable, how can they develop those critical thinking skills?
Yeah, it's like that old saying, you can't learn to swim without getting in the water.
Exactly. And Hume also talks about how some campuses are creating these free speech zones, which, that's just mind-boggling. They're literally restricting free expression to certain designated areas.
It's like, what's the point of a university if you can't even speak your mind freely?
Right. And then there's the whole issue of trigger warnings, which are becoming more and more common in universities.
Yeah. The idea is to alert students to potentially upsetting content.
Right. But Hume argues that trigger warnings actually end up having a chilling effect on free speech.
How so?
Well, if everyone's constantly worried about triggering someone, They're going to be less likely to speak their minds freely. They're going to self-censor, and open inquiry suffers as a result.
It's like we're all walking on eggshells, afraid to say anything that might offend someone.
Exactly. And it also raises the question, who decides what's considered triggering? And is this kind of preemptive censorship really good for students in the long run? I mean, are we protecting them too much? Are we preventing them from developing the resilience they need to navigate a world full of diverse and sometimes challenging viewpoints?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Okay, so let's switch gears a bit. Let's talk about something a little more fun, like football.
Okay.
In Chapter 6, The Football Front, Sending Free Speech Offside, Hume looks at how this whole free speech thing is even impacting the world of sports.
Yeah, football used to be kind of a refuge from, all the rules of polite society.
Right, it was like this raw, unfiltered space.
Yeah. But now there's this expectation that football should be this, bastion of morality and good behavior.
So players and fans have to be extra careful about what they say?
Exactly. They're held to this higher standard now, both on and off the field.
Hume talks about the John Terry case, where the footballer was accused of racial abuse.
Right.
But he was actually cleared in court. It really shows the pressure on football to be seen as morally upstanding, even if it means sacrificing things like due process and free speech.
And it raises this whole question about athletes as role models.
Yeah, I mean, they obviously have a platform.
Right.
And they can influence a lot of people. But does that mean they should be expected to be perfect?
Yeah.
And what happens when their right to free speech clashes with this idea that they have to be role models? It's a tough balance.
It is. And Hume gives some other examples of this crackdown on offensive language in football, like the arrests of Tottenham fans for calling themselves the Yid Army.
I've heard about that, but I don't really understand the controversy.
Well, it's a term that some people find offensive, but others see it as a badge of honor. It's really complicated. And then there's the controversy over a chant by Millwall fans about Leeds United being full of pedos. These cases show how the line between offensive and criminal behavior is getting blurrier.
Yeah, context and intent seem to be getting lost in the rush to punish people.
Exactly. And it brings up this important question, who gets to decide what's offensive? And what are the consequences for crossing that line? Who defines it?
These are all really tough questions. And it leads us to a really key chapter, Chapter 7. There is no right to shout fire in a crowded theater.
Yes, the classic argument against absolute free speech.
Right, the idea that some speech is just too dangerous to allow.
Exactly. This chapter really digs into where that analogy came from and how it's been misused.
Because it did actually come from a real Supreme Court case, right?
It did. It involved a socialist handing out anti-draft leaflets during World War I. The phrase was initially meant to justify limits on speech that posed a clear and present danger, but it's been taken out of context so many times.
Oh, yeah. People use it all the time to justify censoring all kinds of things. They don't even consider whether the speech is actually dangerous.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that even Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, the one who originally came up with the phrase,
he later said he didn't really agree with it anymore. He actually argued for a much more permissive standard for free speech.
Really? So even the guy who coined the phrase thought it was being misused.
It seems that way. But anyway, the fire in a theater argument is still used today to justify all sorts of restrictions on political speech, on comedy, you name it.
And it's like we've lost sight of the whole point of free speech. It's not about protecting speech that everyone agrees with or finds comfortable.
Right.
It's about protecting the right to express ideas, even if they're unpopular, offensive, or even dangerous to some.
That's the core of it. And that's what makes this whole debate so challenging. Because how do you balance safety and security with the right to express yourself freely? Where's the line between protecting people from harm and protecting their right to speak their minds, even if those thoughts and ideas are, well, not very nice? These are tough questions, and we're going to keep wrestling with them as we move into the next chapter.
Thank you for listening to Rambling Dan Rowe's Deep Dive Book Reviews. Please help support our channel by clicking the like and subscribe button. Thank you.
Chapter 8. But words will always hurt me. Here, Hume takes on the argument that some speech is just too hurtful or offensive to allow, which is a really common argument these days, especially with the rise of the whole hate speech concept.
Yeah, this is where the free speech debate gets really emotional. It's one thing to say that people should be allowed to say what they think, but it's hard to actually accept that when someone's saying something that really hurts you or offends you deeply.
Right.
And that's where this hate speech thing comes in. People use it to try and justify restrictions on speech that's seen as harmful or discriminatory towards certain groups. It's a way of trying to protect people from being hurt by words.
I guess it makes sense, but it also seems like we've become really sensitive to offense these days.
We have.
And it feels like some people are using that sensitivity as a weapon.
Yeah, to shut down debate. Silence anyone they disagree with.
Hume argues that we're obsessed with taking offense, and that's created this climate of fear.
Right. People are afraid to speak their minds. They don't want to be labeled as racist, sexist, homophobic, all those things.
Right.
And Hume says this is really dangerous because it undermines the whole foundation of a free society if people can't speak their minds openly.
So what's the answer? How do we protect people from hate speech while also protecting free expression? I mean, how do we find that balance?
That's the big question, isn't it? And unfortunately, there are no easy answers.
I figured.
But Hume does offer some interesting ideas in the rest of the book.
It's tough, right? Like, where do you even draw the line? As we're wrapping up this deep dive into trigger warning, I keep thinking about that image Hume uses. The one with the gun pointed at the head of free speech.
Yeah, it's pretty intense.
It really gets you thinking,
It does. It shows how urgent this whole situation is. Hume's really worried about the direction things are going. He says all these things, like trigger warnings and other forms of censorship. They might seem harmless.
Right, on the surface.
But underneath, they're actually part of this, bigger trend of silencing dissent and creating a culture where everyone's afraid to say anything. He calls it self-censorship.
And it's not just about governments or institutions censoring people directly. It's also about us censoring ourselves. Like, we're afraid to speak our minds because we don't want to deal with backlash or be shamed online or be labeled as, racist or sexist or whatever.
Yeah, it's like we're all walking on eggshells all the time, afraid to say the wrong thing. And that kind of self-censorship, it can be just as bad as any government censorship.
Oh, absolutely. And you know what's interesting?
What's that?
Hume argues that this kind of self-censorship, it often ends up hurting the very people it's supposed to protect. Think about it. If we're too scared to talk honestly about things like race, gender, or religion, those tough issues, how can we ever understand each other? How can we make any progress? It's like sweeping all the dirt under the rug. It might look clean for a while, but all that mess is still there.
Hume's point is we need to have those uncomfortable conversations. We need to engage with ideas that challenge us, and we need to realize that just because someone's offended doesn't mean they've been harmed.
So where do we go from here? What can our listeners do, to push back against this whole censorship thing and, reclaim their right to free speech?
Well, first things first, I'd say go read Trigger Warning yourself. Hume does a great job of explaining his arguments, and even if you don't agree with everything he says, it'll definitely get you thinking.
It's a good starting point.
Yeah. And as you go about your day, just pay attention to the language people are using. Are they actually having open, honest discussions, or are they trying to shut down conversations with those alternative trigger warnings Hume talks about? Those phrases that are designed to stop debate.
Yeah, those are sneaky.
They are. And it's worth asking ourselves, are we using those tactics too? Are we contributing to this culture of fear and silence? Or are we standing up for the right of everyone to express their views?
Even if those views are unpopular or offensive.
Especially then. It's not always easy. It takes courage. But as Hume says, what's the alternative? A world where only certain opinions are allowed. A world where people are afraid to think for themselves. A world where there's no real progress because everyone's too scared to challenge the status quo.
That's a scary thought.
It is. And that's why this whole debate about free speech is so important. We can't take it for granted.
Well said. So, to all our listeners out there, go grab a copy of Trigger Warning, get ready for a good mental workout, and join the fight for free speech. Keep thinking critically, keep asking questions, and most importantly, keep those conversations going. Until next time.